Hello Booktube, I'm Mike and this is Riff Raff's Reading Renaissance. Today I want to do a report back on my reading in May. There was no big chunker for May per the trusty spreadsheet that you've seen before, but the main reading event for me was to read Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. As I've said before on this channel, I am the very last of all the population of the booktubers who has not read this book, and now I'm glad to say I have. And when I saw horror expressed at the fact that I also hadn't seen the film, I've now watched the film as well. And I will tell you that I think the book is better than the film by quite some distance. It's an iconic film, but I think the book is better. For those one or two people out there who haven't read this book, it's set in a sleepy fictional town of Macomb, Alabama, in the period of the Great Depression. It's a novel that combines a coming-of-age story with a sharp examination of racial injustice, morality, and social inequality. It's told through the eyes of the young scout, and we see a society shaped by prejudice, but we see it through the eyes of a child's innocence, as she slowly develops empathy and an awareness of what is going on around her. The central theme is morality in the face of opposition. Atticus Finch is a symbol of integrity and justice. He agrees to defend Tom Robinson, the black man who is falsely accused of attacking a white woman in the face of racial prejudice in the Deep South during the 1930s. This book has been taught in schools for many years, mainly because it prompts discussions about justice, prejudice, empathy, and civic responsibility. Atticus shares advice with his children to understand people by climbing in their skin and walking around in it, emphasizing the need for empathy for others. The use of Scout as a narrator is very effective, both because of the innocence and the observant nature that she has. Through her, we encounter racism and hypocrisy gradually, often recognizing the injustice before she fully does. This perspective allows the novel to criticize social norms without becoming simply preachy. The child's viewpoint balances the novel's darker themes with humor, charm, and warmth. The characters are well written, they're vivid, and they're memorable. Atticus represents the principled idealism. The writing of the minor characters is actually a treat in this novel. Not only does it contribute to creating the social texture of Macomb, but it's highly entertaining and amusing and sometimes a bit wry. It observes the subtle society issues that are not recognized yet in their time. I'll read you two short passages. Today, Aunt Alexandra and her missionary circle were fighting the good fight all over the house. Aunt Alexandra was thriving. Miss Maud must have silenced the whole missionary society at one blow, for Auntie again ruled the roost. Her refreshments grew even more delicious. I learned more about the poor marooners' social life from listening to Mrs. Merriweather. They had so little sense of family that the whole tribe was one big family. A child had as many fathers as there were men in the community, as many mothers as there was women. J. Grimes Everett was doing his utmost to change the state of affairs and desperately needed our prayers. That made me smile. Over the years, this novel has come in for criticism from two major areas. The first is a challenge that it's a white savior narrative, telling a tale of racial prejudice, but telling it through the eyes of the white Atticus and the white scout, rather than the aggrieved black man Tom Robinson, the victim of the actual prejudice. The second challenge is that it oversimplifies racism as if it's an individual moral failing without recognizing that it's an endemic part of the system of the American South of the period. Sitting with the benefit of hindsight of all the years between when it was written and now, I can see these shortcomings. The novel, however, endures because it combines emotional storytelling with ethical seriousness, endearing prose, and well-written, memorable characters. Perhaps it's a novel of its time, but I think it remains relevant as it provokes reflection on justice, empathy, and the gap between social ideas and the reality of the day. I think it's a worthwhile read, and I would recommend it. The other event this month for me was in my series on Read the Beloved Country. This month we tackled the autobiography Down Second Avenue by Ezekiel Mphahlele. And if you haven't seen my video on it, you can catch it here, so I won't spend more time on it now, except to say that it's the first non-fiction work I've tackled in my Read the Beloved Country series, looking at the literature of South Africa. It was a very, very enlightening read. I learned a lot. He's a very respected writer, both in Africa and beyond, and I would recommend anybody check out the video and see if you think it's worth a read. Each month, my trusty spreadsheet directs me to tackle a collection of short stories from a new author each time. This month it was Graham Greene. I have this lovely collection of Graham Greene's complete short stories, and I read 4 stories from this collection during the month. Some time back I read The Quiet American, and I did a discussion with Emily of M Reads on that novel. If you want to see that, there's the link there. But even having read Graham Greene in that novel, I already knew what I found again in the short stories, perhaps even more so, is that no one documents the human experience better than he does, exposing the gaps between how people see themselves and how they behave. The first story, which I was drawn to simply by the title of the story, is called May We Borrow Your Husband? It's a brilliantly nuanced observation of somewhat predatory behavior and innocent naivety. It almost reminds me of Noel Coward on the surface, but underneath there's Greene's characteristic melancholy lurking. I'll read you 2 little passages I've marked in the book. If I had been 20 years older, perhaps I could have explained that nothing is quite as bad as that at the end of what is called the sexual life, the only love which has lasted is the love that has accepted everything, every disappointment, every failure, and every betrayal, which has accepted even the sad fact that in the end there is no desire so deep as the simple desire for companionship. And over the page, it was always easier to get served at Lulu's than to pay the bill. At that moment, everyone always had a habit of disappearing. The old woman, her knitting abandoned on the table, the aunt who helped to serve, Lulu herself, her husband in the blue sweater. If the dog hadn't already gone, he would have left at that moment. So it's just, the writing is wonderful, and the observation of human frailty is extremely endearing and very appealing. I thoroughly enjoyed that story. The second story I tackled was called Awful When You Think of It. It's a strange story. It's an internal monologue from our narrator who projects adult perspectives onto the little baby infant that he's observing. It leaves us with a lingering discomfort. You laugh because some of it's very amusing, but then the laughter curdles. Graham Greene, as always, is reminding us that life's tragedies often arise out of trivial moments. Being short stories, only some of them 10 pages or so long, I can't really tell you much about the story without ruining the effect of the short story. So I'm only focusing, as you can see, on the style of writing and my experience in reading the stories. But I wouldn't hesitate to recommend to anybody reading more Graham Greene. He's simply marvelous. The third story was called Beauty, an observational comedy about a pampered Pekingese and its equally delusional, doting owner. Again, very amusing and very true to life. The characters he draws, you just recognize them from real life. And the fourth one, another oddly titled story, was called The Blue Film. Away from home in musty Bangkok, a wife wants to test some boundaries. No melodrama, just a slow tightening of emotional screws in a story of guilty voyeurism and how the past refuses to stay buried. Quietly devastating. I've said enough. Graham Greene is fantastic. The more you read of him, the better. I read more short stories this month because May had an event called Horror Mayhem, which I'm sure you've heard about because it's all over the place. Now, I'm not really a horror reader, but I thought about this, and particularly the fact that Horror Mayhem's theme was to read short stories around the horror theme. And I thought, okay, I've got some books sitting on my shelf that need to be read that would fall into that category. And the first one I thought of was Roald Dahl. Now, I have this lovely collection of the short stories of Roald Dahl, so I thought, let me give some of these stories a try. Roald Dahl's adult writing is extremely different from his children's books. The children's books tend to champion bravery, etc., but the adult books are more dark, sharper, more cynical about human nature, all of which themes quite appeal to me, if I'm really honest. I've said that before in Booktube. I like the realism of less than perfect characters. Dahl delights in reversals, setting moral traps, and the quiet savagery of seemingly harmless people. His world is one of predators, victims, and people who don't realize which one they are until it's too late. Each story is a small, perfectly engineered device built to unsettle the reader. I read 5 stories from this collection. The first one I read is called The Landlady. Very difficult to tell you much about it because it's legendary. If you know it, you know it. But it is a masterclass in slow burn horror. Dahl turns a cozy bed and breakfast setting into a chamber of quiet menace. It's predation disguised as kindness. In fact, it reminded me a little bit of Graham Greene's May We Borrow Your Husband that I'd read just before. The second story is called An African Story, a very innovative revenge tale, blending cruelty, survival, and the harshness of colonial Africa. I can't say more than that. The third one I read is called Lamb to the Slaughter. This might be Dahl's most wickedly funny story. It's a perfect blend of domestic realism and dark comedy. And if I say any more than that, I really will spoil it. These are short stories, but they are deeply rewarding reading experiences. I read a story in this book called The Bookseller. It's a nastier, more cynical story about fraud and exploitation and the petty cruelties of everyday life, but a good read nonetheless. I found Dahl at his most morally unforgiving. The fifth and last story I read from this collection is called Georgie Porgy. Perhaps it's the strangest of the 5. Grotesque, unsettling, Freudian, and as always, darkly comic. It's a tale of desire and terror where they become indistinguishable from each other. Georgie's Oedipus is indeed complex, and his self-delusion is complete. I'll read you an extract. I was not a player myself, but her ladyship had graciously invited me to drop in and mingle with the guests when play was over at 6 o'clock. I believe she thought that it lent a certain tone to a gathering to have a clergyman present, and she was probably hoping to persuade me to repeat the performance I gave the last time I was there, when I sat at the piano for a full hour and a quarter after supper and entertained the guests with a detailed description of the evolution of the madrigal through the centuries. Dahl's writing is a unique experience, deliciously skewering the human frailties. He's less gentle than Graham Greene. Graham Greene just quietly shows you what the human frailties look like. Dahl tends to roast them on the spit. But he must be doing something right, because he sold 300 million copies of his books. So, that was Roald Dahl. And I wasn't even done with Horror Mayhem yet, because the other author I thought I really should tackle under the umbrella of Horror Mayhem was Edgar Allan Poe, because shockingly, despite having this lovely collection called The Complete Tales and Poems of Edgar Allan Poe, I hadn't read any. I have to confess that when I first encountered Edgar Allan Poe, I wasn't even a reader. I encountered a musical album in the 1970s, which was the period when I was growing up and listening to lots of music. It was an album by a band called the Alan Parsons Project, and the title of the album was Tales of Mystery and Imagination, which is a very Edgar Allan Poe title. It was basically music adaptations of all of Poe's best-known stories, so I'm familiar with the titles, but I haven't read them up till now. So I thought Horror Mayhem was the perfect time to tackle that. And I picked 3 of his most iconic stories, all of which I knew as musical tracks on the album. I read The Fall of the House of Usher, The Cast of Amontillado, and inevitably The Raven. I found Poe at full force: psychological terror, Gothic atmosphere, and slow, delicious unravelling of the human mind. In particular, The Cask of Amontillado, I found a calm, polite, unreliable narrator who is utterly monstrous. We're never told what crime outraged the narrator and for what he seeks revenge. And that's the hook that drives the power of the narrative and progresses to its inevitable conclusion. The horror is quiet, no screaming, no gore, just the mundane sound of bricklaying. If you know, you know. It talks of the impact of revenge on both the revengee as much as the revenger. I then read The Fall of the House of Usher, a masterpiece in Gothic atmosphere with themes of degeneration, of the family, of the mind, of the self. Poe turned mental illness into architecture. The house is a character, cracked, decaying, suffocating, a physical manifestation of the Usher bloodline in the story. Roderick and Madeline are twins, less like siblings, more like two halves of one doomed soul. The psychological terror builds: Roderick's hypersensitivity, the narrator's growing dread, blurring the line between reality and hallucination. The ending, which I won't spoil, is a perfect externalization of internal ruin and decay. If you haven't read it, read it. The writing is a little bit like Henry James. Poe requires the reader to really concentrate at a level that doesn't allow for scrolling cell phones or other distractions. But the reward is deep. Brilliant characterizations that emerge. I'll read you an extract here. Upon my entrance, Usher arose from a sofa on which he had been lying at full length, and greeted me with a vivacious warmth which had much in it. I at first thought of an overdone cordiality, of the constrained effort of the ennui man of the world. A glance, however, at his countenance convinced me of his perfect sincerity. We sat down, and for some moments, while he spoke not, I gazed upon him with a feeling half of pity, half of awe. Surely a man has never before so terribly altered in so brief a period as had Roderick Usher. It was with difficulty that I could bring myself to admit the identity of the wan being before me with the companion of my early boyhood. Yet the character of his face had been at all times remarkable. A cadaverousness of complexion, an eye large, liquid and luminous beyond comparison, lips somewhat thin and very pallid, but of a surpassingly beautiful curve, a nose of a delicate Hebrew model, but with a breadth of nostril unusual in similar formations, a finely moulded chin, speaking, in its want of prominence, of a want of moral energy, hair of a more than web-like softness and tenuity, these features, with an inordinate expression above the regions of the temple, made up altogether a countenance not easily to be forgotten. You see what I mean? You have to concentrate. It's worth it in the end, but you do have to concentrate. It was a great read. I did thoroughly enjoy it. And then I moved on to perhaps the best known work from Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven, his poem. It's a hypnotic descent into grief and obsession and self-torment. Poe uses dramatic language, emotional intensity, and symbolic imagery, as well as a musicality that reminded me of the album where I first met these titles. The poem's rhythm and internal rhyme mechanism create a spell-like effect in the same way that Alan Parsons cannot let go of Lenore. The poem dramatizes the paralysis of self-torment. The raven is a symbol of eternal grief. Of interest, I discovered that in real life, Poe lost several important women in his life: his mother, his foster mother, and his wife Virginia, to illness. This left a deep psychological imprint. However, Lenore is not a historical person. She is Poe's emotional ghost, the poetic embodiment of his combined grief. She appears in many of his poems, taking different guises. There's a poem called Lenore, there's one called Annabel Lee, there's Ulaluma, and 2-1 in Paradise, all of which feature Lenore, but she serves different purposes in each poem. That was fascinating. I enjoyed the experience of reading the unique writing of one of the horror genre's favorite sons. The next thing I'd like to report back in my May Reads report was the arrival of some new books during the month of May. It's always an occupational hazard in my life. People recommend books to me. I stumble upon charity sales, and I'm not very good at saying no when great books jump into my path. There's a lot to show you this month, so I'll get going. First of all, I was very delighted to find a copy of the Norton Anthology of Poetry. Someone said you can't have too many anthologies of poetry, and I take that at face value. And in the same breath, I found the Oxford Book of English Verse. These were all at bargain basement prices, so I couldn't resist, and they all came home. It's lovely to have the reference works when one wants to delve into poetry for whatever reason. Another find, which I really didn't have on my radar at all, and suddenly there it was in front of me, was Boswell's The Life of Samuel Johnson. This beautiful old copy, which if I open it in front, has a date in it of 1946. It's literally The Life of Samuel Johnson by James Boswell, illustrations by Gordon Ross. Let's have a look. There's lovely old illustrations by Gordon Ross. And I just looked at this and I thought, this is part of reading history. I can't possibly leave this behind. So that came along. Another book I picked up was Ben Elton's novel called The Two Brothers. And the reason I was fascinated by this, you will remember if you watch my channel regularly, that I recently read the autobiography of Ben Elton and absolutely loved it. And in it he talks about the books he's written. And he mentioned that this book is based on the true story of two brothers who were uncles of Ben Elton. They were both living in Berlin in 1920s in the shadows of Nazi uprising and development. One was a Jew and one was an adopted Aryan, and they ended up fighting on opposite sides in World War II. There's the beautiful cover with the swastikas at the Brandenburg Gate. So I thought this is such a powerful premise, especially the fact that it's based on a true story. It's described as Ben Elton's most powerful novel to date, but more importantly, he cited in his autobiography that this was the book that meant the most to him and that he was most proud of having written. So when I saw it in front of me, it had to come home with me. In passing, some other fiction that I picked up along the way, a copy of Gone Girl, a rather salacious copy, which I'll just flash past fast, of Emile Zola's book Nana, Salman Rushdie's book Quichotte, which is his retelling or reworking of Don Quixote. You can see the two characters there on the front cover. This, of course, I'll need to put on the back burner because I have yet to read Don Quixote, and I will obviously need to read that first. I now own Don Quixote, I own a Salman Rushdie reworking of it, and I also own an Anthony Burgess reworking of it. So I've got my work cut out for me in that respect. Another wonderful find on the thrift shop trail was this edition of all the big novels of Daphne du Maurier. If I open up the contents page, you can see them all there. Rebecca, Jamaica Inn, Frenchman's Creek, and My Cousin Rachel. If you get all of those, you've pretty much got Daphne du Maurier covered. And these are absolutely beautiful. This Octopus Heineken series of large bound volumes like this was a big hit in the 1980s. If you look around, you can find them secondhand. They're very cheap, and they're a lovely way to collect a series. If you prop them all up on the bookcase together, they're very handsome looking editions. The finds this month just keep on coming. I heard two people on Booktube talk about this next book, both Steve Donahue and Shelley Swearingen, who both said this is the best book they've read on the subject of Queen Elizabeth I. And that is Elizabeth Jenkins's biography, Elizabeth the Great. I won't bore you with the tale, but it was a series of coincidences, including wrong orders and returns for credit and all that kind of thing, that suddenly I had to choose a book to a value of a certain amount, and I spotted this, and there it was. So I thought, that's fortuitous, and we'll file it away under the heading of Booktube made me do it. On a more serious note, as the world collapses around us, I've had recommended to me that one should read this book called The Coming Storm, Power, Conflict and Warnings from History by Odd Arne Westad. And I've just started in, but it's been highly recommended to me. It's not a long book, it's 200 odd pages. I tend to personally look at today's global news and see shades of the 1939 concerns, whereas this book makes the argument that actually we're more mirroring the events that happened just in the run-up to the First World War. Neither scenario of which is that encouraging, but perhaps forewarned is forearmed, so I thought I'd better have a read of that. Sticking with world history, I stumbled across two books on North Korea. One was called Dear Leader, From Trusted Insider to Enemy of the State, My Escape from North Korea by Jang Jing-sun. That sounds like an interesting read. And sitting right next to it was a book called Nothing to Envy, winner of the BBC Samuel Johnson Prize in 2010, Nothing to Envy, Real Lives in North Korea by Barbara Demick. An outstanding work of journalism, said the Times. So, two books on North Korea. And still with history, I read earlier this year several current books by Anne Applebaum and was tremendously impressed. She wrote books on the decline of democracy, and specifically her latest book was Autocracy, Inc., about how the autocrats around the world, even if they have nothing in common ideologically other than their autocracy, are working in a sort of a loose cabal to support each other and maintain their grip on power. I was so impressed by her writing that I did a little research on other books she's written, and I discovered that she had won a Pulitzer Prize for her book called Gulag, which is the history of the Russian prison system. And eventually I found it. It's literally called Gulag, A History. Anthony Beaver, who's well known as a historian, says, important and moving, a terrifying and unforgettable story. It won the Pulitzer in 2004. And well-known historical writer Simon Sebag Montefiore says on the back here, a magisterial study that brings to life the hell of Russia's gulags. It moves as much as it shocks. I became aware during the month of a controversy between various economists, one of which was Gary Stevenson, who's quite vocal economist now in terms of what's wrong with particularly the UK economy and what should happen, and being a proponent of a wealth tax. And therefore I picked up a copy of his book called Trading Game. He came to fame by making an absolute fortune in the trading markets of London, and he's now stepped away from that world and has become an advocate for wealth taxes in the UK, which is a controversial position for an economist to hold. And this book is described as The Wolf of Wall Street with a Moral Compass. Stevenson had a meteoric rise from the rags of East London to the riches of Citibank, and his book charts that journey, a darkly funny book that makes a convincing case that high finance is as toxic, reckless, and deeply cynical as ever. There's still more to come. In the Battle of the Sexes, there were two books, one by New York Times columnist Maureen O'Dowd called Are Men Necessary? There you go. It's quite woke of me to be reading a book like that. Just to balance the scales, I bought the Norton Book of Women's Lives. These Norton anthologies are always wonderful, and this anthology includes 61 substantial selections from the 20th century literature of women's lives, autobiographies, journals, and memoirs. As varied in humanity as in geography, the women whose life stories are collected here include the famous Maya Angelou, Anne Frank, Maxine Hong Kingston, Virginia Woolf, and the unexpected, Emma Mashinini, a South African black labor organizer, Oni Lee Logan, an Alabama granny midwife, Sarah Soleri, an expatriate in America who reflects hilariously on the language of food in her native Pakistan. Then I picked up two books which we can probably file away under the heading of self-justification. And these books were called Messy and A Perfect Mess. They're basically covering the same subject. The first one says, Messy, How to Be Creative and Resilient in a Tidy-Minded World by Tim Harford. And I have to tell you, that resonated with me. If you look behind me, you might not be surprised that I would be attracted to a book that argued the merits of being messy. This one, A Perfect Mess, says, The hidden benefits of disorder, how crammed closets, cluttered offices, and on-the-fly planning make the world a better place. I've always been a little bit of an exponent of that old saying that says a tidy desk is a sign of a sick mind. But I do suspect once I've read these, I'll know whether there's validity to the argument. But it did hit a chord that just resonated with me to say, maybe I'm not the only one. Maybe there is some reason and method in my madness. Next up is the world of entertainment, and here I stumbled across a few real gems. I'm a huge fan of Alan Rickman in all his various guises, and I'm sure most of you will agree with me. What I did discover was that he, like Burton a little while ago, has released his diaries posthumously. They're called Madly Deeply, the Alan Rickman Diaries. He had no intention of releasing these apparently, but his wife has decided to release them, and therefore the beauty of that arrangement is they're not written for public consumption, and therefore they're pretty brutally honest about all the people that he worked with. As it says on the back here, detailing the extraordinary and the ordinary, he writes in a way that is anecdotal, indiscreet, witty, gossipy, and utterly candid. That sounds like an absolute joy. And because this is his version of his life, I thought I'd balance it with another book, which is a biography of him written by Maureen Peyton. It's the unauthorized biography. So here you have two versions of Alan Rickman's life, and I'll tell you later which one I believe is the more accurate. While on the subject of brilliant entertainers, I could not resist when I found a copy of Kenneth Branagh's book about making the film Hamlet. It's just called Hamlet. It's the script from the film of Hamlet, which most people accept as the definitive version of Hamlet. But what's beautiful about it is lavishly illustrated. There's all kinds of scenes from the film. Those who know the film will know that it sports a cast of 5-star actors from the best of British Shakespearean theatre, and it's just a lovely little indulgence, so I could not let that pass. And just when you thought I was getting over my fetish about Richard Burton, here it comes again. This book is called Furious Love, Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, and the Marriage of the Century. I'll admit this was a weakness. I am fascinated both by Richard Burton's life, and of course I'm totally enamored with that voice. So I couldn't resist. Can't be a month without something coming up in the way of music books, of course. And this month I found this rather interesting book called Cowboys and Indies, which is the epic history of the record industry. And if ever there's a book that I'm not going to be able to resist, it's a book about the history of the music industry, which I find endlessly fascinating. And finally, one I was not thinking of or looking for, but stumbled across my path, was Eric Newby's book, A Book of Lands and People. It is an anthology of several centuries worth of the world's best travel writing, from Herodotus to Wilfrid Thesiger, from Christopher Columbus to Paul Thoreau, from Nick Danziger to Marco Polo. Eric Newby has brought together the absolute cream of the travel writing crop into one beautiful and fascinating volume. There is simply no other book like it. I think they saw me coming, guys. And finally, in one of my previous videos, I talked about the fact that I may not actually read The Lord of the Rings, and this has caused as much of a ripple as I'm capable of causing within the Booktube community. But I did want to assure you that I'm open-minded. So open-minded, in fact, that when I stumbled across a lovely and reasonably priced copy of The Lord of the Rings, I bought it. So I now own this rather lovely French flaps, detailed maps inside. So I'm not closing the door on The Lord of the Rings. Here it is. You all know it. I don't need to tell you about The Lord of the Rings. I'm simply showing you that I am open-minded. It's not high on my priority list, I must confess, but that's more about things that I desperately want to read than about any strong feeling for or against this book. And just to help me in that journey, I also picked up at the same occasion, I picked up this book called In Defense of Fantasy Now, you can't blame me for trying. You really can't. This is a study of the genre in English and American literature since 1945. With a title like In Defense of Fantasy, I thought, well, let me see what they're saying and let's see if they can persuade me, okay? Because I'm not instinctively interested in fantasy. I find it an unappealing genre from where I sit now. But in the same way as I have dipped my toe into science fiction, I read Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness and had a really, really good reading experience. That doesn't mean I'm now a sci-fi fan. It just means I do not dismiss any books. I don't actually obsess about genre. I tend to look and listen to people who I respect about the quality of a particular writer or a particular book, irrespective of what genre they dabble in. If I use the parallel from music, I don't limit a recording artist to only recording an album within one predefined genre. I think genres are often created by the marketing department more than the artists who actually create, be it music or books, etc. So we'll see what comes out of In Defense of Fantasy. Next up, we must talk about where I go in June. If I consult the trusty spreadsheet, the big news is it says it's all about a big chunker. June on the Range, Lonesome Dove. Me and almost all the rest of Booktube, from what I can see. This year seems to be the year when Lonesome Dove just is hogging the spotlight for June on the Range. A lot of people, maybe even people who don't normally read a lot of Westerns, are all plumping for this book. I've just dipped my toe. I read sort of the first chapter as we approach June, and it has already struck me as very well read. I must tell you a story. Before I knew who Larry McMurtry was, the author of this book, I knew his son, James McMurtry, as a recording artist in the music field who writes fantastic singer-songwriter type songs in the Americana sort of vein. I have completely loved James McMurtry and his ability to tell stories for a long time. So being told that Larry McMurtry was his father, it wasn't a hard sell to make me think that maybe this family has a gene in it that's good at storytelling. It's a 900-page book, so we'll need to be a bit strategic. I'll need to work out a daily page target to make sure we get through the event. June on the Range, of course, was created by Michael K. Vaughan, and all you have to do to qualify is read one Western, whether it's a short Louis L'Amour or a Zane Grey, or go back and read Shane that we all remember from childhood. Any of those would qualify, but obviously in my case, it's going to be Lonesome Dove and probably nothing else because it's such a big book. I'm still taking part in Historathon Quarter 2, where we're supposed to read from the sort of Middle Ages, and I'm cheating. I'm reading Suetonius's 12 Caesars because I haven't read that and I want to read that. I've ended up with two versions. I have the Penguin Classic version here, and I also have a lovely illustrated version of the 12 Caesars. They are both Robert Graves translations, but this original illustrated one, it was released in 2000, and the Penguin Classic is an updated translation released in 2007 with a revised version of Graves's translation by James B. Reeves. So, and I've read the introduction to this where he explains what that revision involves and the fact that the original version by Graves was written of its time and was attempting to make it easier for the people of that time, and the challenge that's taken up in the more recent revision of that translation is that some of the colloquialisms of the time are no longer relevant and will not help the modern reader today. So again, the translation has been sort of revised to make it as accessible as possible to the modern reader. So I'm grateful for the current modern translation, but I couldn't resist as well the richly illustrated book that basically allows you Caesar by Caesar as you go through to see illustrations and replications of the artifacts, etc. I thought that would make the reading experience that much more interesting and lively. So that's the 12 Caesars, which is I need to complete during the month of June. If I look at the spreadsheet in terms of which short stories we're reading this month, Here it's all about P.G. Wodehouse, and I think that was chosen because I needed something light and easy, because my main thrust, of course, will be on Lonesome Dove, which is a big book to get through. But this is the lovely book called Wodehouse on Wodehouse. Sheer pleasure to read Wodehouse on Wodehouse is to read Wodehouse. Anthony Burgess. So I'm sold. If I have time for another book from the music side, it's probably going to be Grail Marcus's biography of Bob Dylan, Folk Music, Bob Dylan's biography in 7 songs. Grail Marcus has been writing about Dylan all his life, and there's no one really who writes better about him than that. I know some people on Booktube either love Dylan or don't like Dylan, but I must tell you the other thing, I'll just sneak in quickly before I wrap this video up, that I managed to find a copy of this book up here called Bob Dylan Mixing Up the Medicine. Now this is one of these massive, very expensive, never before revealed pictures, photos, access to archives. It's got, just to give you an idea of the intensity of the research that's gone into this book, there are pictures here of a young Bob Dylan. There are pictures of him with his classmates and a guitar. There are photos of the parents that he tried to hide from us all for so many years. It just goes on and on and on. There's class photographs. It is literally the be-all and end-all work on Bob Dylan. And the reason I'd never bought this before is that it has been horrendously expensive. And that changed the other day when I discovered an opportunity. It was obviously a last one in stock, and they wanted to clear it because I paid something like 20% of the recommended price for this book. It was still a considerable amount of money, I tell you, but it was a once-in-a-lifetime chance to actually own something that is one of the iconic books in the library of Bob Dylan. I've already got a lot of Bob Dylan books, but this is a significant one to take pride of place. So that's the wrap-up of the month I've had, the reading I've done, the books that have tumbled joyously into my life. It's been another great reading month. I've got a big challenge ahead in terms of Lonesome Dove. I need to be strategic and intentional in how I read it, but I think from the first pages that I've delved into, I don't think I'm going to battle to enjoy the story, which makes all the difference. I hope you will enjoy your reading in June as much as I do, no matter what you're reading, as long as you're reading, that's the main path. And if you've enjoyed this video, thank you so much for coming with me on the journey. Please leave a like, subscribe, comment, etc. You know the routine. It does make a difference. My numbers are sneaking slowly up, and I'm very grateful for that support from all of you who watch my channel. So, on that happy note, let's get reading, and I'll say bye-bye now.